Picture a woman sitting alone in her car in a quiet parking lot. She has been there for about 11 minutes. Her phone is in her hand and there is a message on the screen. She is just staring at it. Not because she doesn't understand it, but because she understands it too well. For the first time in her adult life, she feels something unfamiliar. No urge to reply. No pressure to respond. No emotional pull to fix, explain, or comfort. And that absence of reaction unsettles her deeply. Not because the message is harmful or the sender is dangerous, but because something inside her has shifted. She doesn't care in the way she used to, and now she is confronted with a question she has never had to ask herself before. Who am I if I'm not the one who always cares? If you've ever experienced that kind of silence, that strange emotional stillness where your instinct to always show up for others suddenly disappears, then you know how uncomfortable it feels. It can feel like something is wrong, like you are changing into someone unfamiliar. But what comes after this moment is not what most people assume. It is not emotional damage. It is not coldness. It is not collapse. It is actually one of the most powerful internal shifts a person can experience. To understand this, you first have to understand what people really mean when they say empath. It's often used for someone sensitive, someone emotional, someone who easily picks up on the feelings of others. But the deeper truth goes further than that. An empath is not just someone who feels deeply. An empath is someone whose identity becomes built around responding to other people's emotions. Over time, their sense of worth becomes tied to how useful they are. Their sense of belonging depends on how available they are. And what they call love slowly becomes connected to saving, fixing, and supporting everyone around them. This isn't just personality. It becomes a psychological pattern shaped over years, often beginning in environments where emotional safety was unpredictable and where paying attention to others was necessary just to maintain peace. Most people like this don't even realize when it started. They only know that being there for others feels natural. Saying yes feels easier than saying no. Putting themselves last feels normal. And for a long time, this creates a sense of purpose. People appreciate them. They rely on them. They become the emotional center of many relationships. The one who listens. The one who understands. The one who never seems to run out of patience. At first, it feels like connection. It feels like meaning. But over time, something changes. That constant giving begins to drain them in a way that is hard to explain. It's not simple tiredness. It feels deeper, heavier, like emotional exhaustion living in the body. They start realizing that no matter how much they give, it never feels balanced. Instead, it creates expectation. It creates dependency. And it creates a version of life where they are always present for others, but rarely present for themselves. Eventually, a breaking point arrives quietly. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a growing awareness of emptiness after giving everything. And in that space, something begins to shift. They start observing more carefully. They stop reacting automatically. They begin noticing patterns they once ignored. They see who only shows up during crisis. They see who keeps taking but rarely gives back. They see who pulls them in emotionally without ever truly holding space for them in return. And once they see it clearly, they cannot unsee it. This is where most people misunderstand what is happening. They assume the person is shutting down or becoming emotionally distant. But in reality, something more precise is happening psychologically. It is a shift from living externally to living internally. For so long, their emotional world was controlled by others. Other people's moods, needs, and reactions shaped how they felt about themselves. Now that begins to change. Slowly, they stop feeling responsible for emotions that are not theirs. They stop treating other people's chaos as something they must fix. They begin separating what belongs to them and what does not. And this is not detachment. It is clarity. It is the nervous system finally recalibrating after years of overextension. It is the mind learning that love does not require self-erasure. What follows is not the end of empathy. It is the end of imbalance. They don't become less caring. They become more aware of where their care is going. They stop pouring endlessly into relationships that only consume them. And for the first time, they begin to understand that real connection does not require sacrifice of the self. And in that parking lot moment, staring at a message without the urge to respond, something quietly powerful is born. Not coldness, not emptiness, but the beginning of self-recognition. What happens next is where everything becomes even clearer. She begins to realize the difference between what she can truly influence and what she has only been trying to influence in her mind. For years, she has poured enormous energy into trying to fix, adjust, and emotionally manage situations that were never fully hers to control. And in doing so, she mistook effort for impact. That realization hits in a way that is both unsettling and freeing. Because once you see how much of your energy has been spent on things that were never actually within your responsibility, a new question naturally emerges. If I stopped doing all of that, what would I have left? What could I build, create, or protect if I kept that energy for myself instead? And that question quietly starts to reshape everything. But before any of this feels empowering, there is something heavier she has to go through: guilt. And if this part is skipped or misunderstood, nothing else really settles properly. Because this shift does not feel like liberation in the beginning. It feels like something is going wrong. It feels like she is becoming selfish or cold or disconnected from the people who rely on her. The mind that has been trained for years to define her worth through care and emotional availability does not stay silent. It reacts. It starts telling her things she can't easily ignore. That she is abandoning people. That she is becoming someone unkind. That good people don't step back. That if she truly cared, she would keep showing up no matter what. And for someone who has lived as an empath for so long, those thoughts don't sound like fear or conditioning. They sound like responsibility. They sound like morality. They feel like truth. So she sits with that discomfort. She feels the guilt fully and still chooses not to return to the old patterns. She continues protecting her time, her energy, her emotional space, even while something inside her insists she is doing something wrong. This is one of the most mentally demanding experiences a person can go through because it creates an internal conflict between old identity and new awareness. But if she looks closer, she starts to understand what that guilt actually is. It is not a sign that she is doing something wrong. It is a residue of conditioning. It comes from a time when staying emotionally tuned into others wasn't just a habit, it was a survival strategy. It was how she stayed connected, how she stayed safe, how she maintained a sense of belonging. Over time, she was taught directly or indirectly that her value depended on how much she could give. That love had to be earned through emotional effort. That being needed was the same as being loved. That her role was to keep things stable, even if she was the one paying the cost. When she understands this, the guilt doesn't vanish instantly, but it changes form. It stops being a command she must obey and starts becoming information she can observe. It points to where her old beliefs still live and where healing still needs to continue. As she begins to care less in an automatic, indiscriminate way, something else starts to happen internally. Psychologically, it can be described as a restructuring of identity. The version of her that was always the caretaker, the emotional supporter, the one constantly available to others, begins to loosen its hold. And before a new sense of self fully takes shape, there is a strange in-between space. She may feel detached, like she is slightly outside of her own life. She may feel uncertain about who she is without her usual role. At times, there may even be a sense of grief, and that grief is real. Because even though that old identity was exhausting, it was also familiar. And the brain tends to confuse familiarity with safety. So letting go of even a painful version of self can trigger the same emotional response as losing something important. But what follows this phase is where the real transformation begins. One of the first noticeable changes is in how she communicates, or more accurately, what she stops trying to communicate. For a long time, she has been someone who explains everything, not because she lacks confidence, but because she believes understanding can be reached if she just finds the right words. She assumes that if she is clear enough, patient enough, and emotionally honest enough, the other person will eventually meet her where she is. So she explains, she adds context, she softens her language, she over-details her emotions so there is no room for misunderstanding. She tries to make herself completely visible through explanation, but then something shifts. She begins to realize something difficult but very clear. Some people were never trying to understand her in the first place. Not because they couldn't, but because truly understanding her would require accountability. It would require them to acknowledge their own behavior, their own patterns, their own impact. And instead of doing that, they stay in selective understanding. They hear what benefits them and ignore what doesn't. They twist clarity into debate. They turn honesty into confusion. And every time she explains, she unknowingly gives them more material to avoid responsibility. So she starts doing something very different. She stops over-explaining. And at first, that silence feels unfamiliar, but it is not emptiness. It is intention. It is control over her own energy. It is a decision not to keep feeding dynamics that only drain her. Because for someone who used communication as her main way of maintaining connection, choosing silence is not withdrawal, it is discipline. It is trust in her own perception without needing it constantly validated by others. And something surprising happens when she stops explaining so much. She begins to see people more clearly. Without her constant effort to clarify, justify, or smooth things over, the truth of relationships becomes easier to notice. She can see who genuinely tries to understand her without needing perfect explanations. And she can also see who was only ever engaging when it benefited them and who disappears when effort is required on their side. That clarity can feel uncomfortable at first, but it is honest. And at this stage of her growth, honesty matters more than comfort. And then comes a deeper misunderstanding she has to unlearn: the difference between true emotional detachment and emotional shutdown. From the outside, people often assume she is becoming distant or numb. But what is actually happening is not emotional collapse. It is awareness. Real detachment is not about shutting emotions off. It is about no longer being pulled under by them. It is like standing behind a window and watching a storm. She can still see it clearly. She can still understand its movement. She can still feel its intensity. But she is no longer inside it. She is no longer being carried by every emotional wave around her. She is no longer reacting automatically. She is observing with clarity instead of absorbing everything around her, and this shift does not reduce her emotional intelligence. It strengthens it. Because real clarity only becomes possible when you are no longer drowning in what you are trying to understand. For the first time, she has distance, and that distance changes everything. This is the point where her awareness becomes something deeper, almost undeniable. She is no longer filtering life through the need to fix everything, smooth everything, or emotionally rescue every situation. She doesn't rush to erase discomfort just to feel at peace again, and she doesn't automatically fill in the gaps in other people's behavior with overly kind assumptions that protect them while slowly hurting her own clarity. Instead, she starts seeing things as they are, and what she sees is often far simpler than she ever allowed herself to believe. People reveal themselves through patterns, not moments, through consistency, not promises. The complexity was never really in them. The real complexity was in her resistance to accept what had already been clearly shown to her over and over again. Detachment removes that inner conflict. It allows her to take things at face value, not in a bitter or judgmental way, but in an honest one. If someone has repeatedly shown that they only value her emotions when it suits them, she no longer has to reinterpret it or soften it in her mind. She can simply register it as information. She stops trying to rewrite the story. She stops waiting for one perfect moment that suddenly changes everything. Instead, she adjusts how much of herself she gives based on what has actually been demonstrated, not what she hopes might one day happen. That isn't emotional hardness. That is clarity. And clarity often looks like distance to the people who were comfortable when things were unclear. And this is where something important needs to be understood about the reaction of others when this shift begins. Because the moment she pulls back, something changes in the environment around her. Not always openly, not always directly, but noticeably. People don't simply accept the new distance. They respond to it, sometimes loudly, sometimes in very subtle ways. It might show up as guilt disguised as concern. It might appear as small comments meant to remind her of who she used to be. Or it could even be sudden emotional crises that appear right when she begins to step back. These patterns are not random. They are responses to change in the dynamic. This is often called reactive pressure. It happens when someone who is a steady emotional support system begins to withdraw, because people don't easily let go of consistent emotional access. When that access starts disappearing, there is an attempt, conscious or unconscious, to restore it. So they adjust their behavior. They become slightly more attentive, more present, sometimes even temporarily more caring. And for someone who has spent a long time hoping for that version of them, it can feel like confirmation. It can feel like proof that if she had just stayed a little longer, tried a little harder, things would have finally changed. But what is actually happening is not real transformation. It is stabilization. It is a short-term adjustment designed to restore balance without changing the underlying pattern. It is enough effort to keep the connection alive, but not enough to truly shift the relationship. And when she begins to see this clearly, everything changes. She learns to recognize the difference between real growth and temporary performance, between genuine emotional change and behavior designed to regain access to her presence. And that awareness becomes one of the most protective skills she ever develops because it doesn't require her to become cold or distrustful. It only requires her to observe consistently over time. When the temporary effort fades, as it always does, she no longer collapses into confusion or self-blame. She doesn't increase her effort. She doesn't chase understanding. She simply takes note of what has been revealed and adjusts her internal understanding of that person accordingly. There is no emotional chaos in that process anymore. Just recognition, just clarity, just movement forward. And then comes the final stage of this transformation, the one that doesn't need explanation or confrontation. It happens quietly. She stops showing up in certain places, not everywhere, not for everyone, but specifically where her presence has always meant overextending herself, shrinking her needs, and slowly disappearing into roles that were never balanced in the first place. She stops initiating contact where effort has always been one-sided. She stops maintaining connections that only survive because she carries them. She stops performing emotional maintenance for relationships that have never met her halfway. And she does it without announcement, without explanation, without needing to justify the change, because her presence was never something small. It was something foundational, something people got used to without noticing how much it held together. So, when she steps back, quietly and consistently, the absence becomes noticeable in a way words could never achieve. People begin to feel what they never had to notice before. The emotional weight she used to absorb, the stability she used to provide, the gaps she used to fill without being asked. And now, all of that is simply no longer being carried. That absence speaks more honestly than anything she ever said out loud. It says everything that words were never able to express. I was here. I showed up fully. I meant it. And you didn't really notice until I stopped. And in that silence, there is something else being communicated just as clearly. She is no longer available for the same kind of arrangement. If there is going to be any future, it cannot be built on the same imbalance, the same emotional weight resting on one side. Either it changes fundamentally or it doesn't continue at all. She doesn't need to say it out loud. The absence carries that message with far more precision than any explanation ever could. And underneath all of this, there is something important that ties everything together. What she is going through is not about becoming less loving. It is about learning how to love with clarity, with direction, and with awareness. Because love that is given without any discernment, without any sense of where it is going or whether it is being received properly, slowly turns into exhaustion. It turns into self-neglect disguised as care. It becomes something that drains the giver while also failing to truly support the receiver in any meaningful way. That kind of love might feel pure at first, but over time it becomes unsustainable. Not just for her, but for everyone involved. The shift she is experiencing is not a reduction of love, it is a refinement of it. She is learning to protect her energy, to stop over-explaining herself, to stop trying to emotionally compensate for what others refuse to take responsibility for. She is learning to step away from situations where her presence was taken for granted and not truly valued. And in doing so, she doesn't become less open or less caring. She becomes more intentional. What she gives now comes from a place that is no longer drained, no longer resentful, no longer forced. It comes from wholeness instead of depletion. That changes everything, because love that is rooted in exhaustion always carries hidden weight. It comes with unspoken resentment, even when it is given freely. But love that comes from self-respect feels different. It is lighter. It is clearer. It knows when to give and when to stop. It doesn't disappear into others. It stays grounded in itself. She is not cold. She is not broken. She is not shutting down emotionally. She is becoming more aware than she has ever been before. And that awareness changes how she relates to everything around her. The people who are capable of meeting her at that level will feel it immediately, because there is a different quality to being loved by someone who is no longer abandoning themselves in the process. That kind of love is not chaotic. It is not confusing. It is not inconsistent. It is steady, honest, and real. It asks for mutual effort. It respects boundaries. It knows when to stay and when to leave, and it does both without losing its center. You don't have to announce when you reach this stage. There is no dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. It happens quietly, internally. It might feel like that same moment in the parking lot again. Sitting still, phone in hand, a message on the screen, And instead of reacting, instead of rushing to fix or respond or explain, there is simply stillness. At first, that stillness feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but if you stay with it, something shifts. You realize you are not losing yourself. You are meeting yourself for the first time without all the noise. And that realization changes how you see everything that came before it. It stops being about what you failed to fix in others. It stops being about how much you gave or how much you endured. It becomes about understanding that you were never meant to lose yourself in order to be connected to anyone. Because this is not the end of your emotional depth. It is the beginning of your emotional alignment. And once you understand that, you don't go back to the same version of yourself that overgave, overexplained, and overextended just to keep things together. You move forward differently now. More aware, more grounded, more whole. And that quiet shift inside you becomes the foundation for everything that comes next. What this entire journey reveals is not a story of someone becoming distant, cold, or disconnected, but someone finally learning how to see clearly without abandoning herself in the process. For so long, she lived in a pattern where love meant overgiving, understanding meant over-explaining, and connection meant constant emotional availability, even at the cost of her own peace. She became the person who absorbed everything, fixed everything, and carried everything, believing that this was what made her valuable. But over time, that kind of love slowly turned into exhaustion, not because she cared too much, but because she cared without boundaries or balance. The transformation begins the moment she stops reacting automatically to everything around her and starts observing instead. She begins to notice patterns she once excused, behaviors she once justified, and emotional dynamics she once carried alone. And in that awareness, something shifts permanently. She realizes that not everything requires her involvement, not every emotion requires her response, and not every relationship deserves equal access to her energy. What once felt like guilt begins to reveal itself as old conditioning, not truth. What once felt like responsibility begins to dissolve into clarity. She learns that stepping back is not abandonment, it is alignment. Silence is not weakness, it is protection. Distance is not rejection, it is discernment. And through this process, she discovers something she was never truly taught before, that love without self-respect becomes self-erasure, but love grounded in awareness becomes something stable, honest, and real. She is no longer the version of herself that confuses being needed with being valued. She becomes someone who understands that presence has weight, energy has value, and emotional investment must be mutual to be sustainable. And in that realization, everything changes quietly but completely. She does not lose her capacity to love, she refines it. She does not shut people out. She simply stops disappearing within them. And that is where her real strength begins, not in how much she endures for others, but in how fully she finally chooses herself without apology.